A Russian woman criticized the policy of Russian President Vladimir Putin towards Ukraine, including the so-called special operation, asking a rhetorical question regarding the original Chinese lands that are now part of the Russian Federation. The woman quite reasonably noted that Russians who advocate for the SVO in Ukraine should not resist if official Beijing suddenly announces the beginning of a similar military operation on the territory of the Russian Federation to return the original Chinese lands. Does it mean that China is then obliged to conduct a military offensive in the Far East and return its historical lands? And then the Russians should not object because China has the right to restore historical justice? She emphasized. In addition, the Russian woman reminded the authorities of her country that when the Soviet Union collapsed and an independent Russian Federation and an independent Ukraine were formed, both sides signed the relevant documents and took on the obligation to respect each other's borders. Recall, China has a long historical memory of Far Eastern territories being seized by the Russians. In the mid-19th century, at the end of the Opium Wars, the weak Qing dynasty ceded 1.4 million square kilometers of land, including the whole area east of the Ussuri and northeast of the Amur River to the Pacific coast in what was then called Outer Manchuria and now constitutes much of Russia's Far East. This territory annexed to the Tsarist Empire in the Aigun 1858 and Beijing 1860 treaties was later absorbed by the Soviet Union. By some calculations, the total territory once under Chinese imperial sovereignty that passed to Russian control amounted to almost 6 million square kilometers. As early as 1919, when the outcome of the Russian Civil War was still in doubt, Lev Karakan, the Deputy People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union, made promises to China that the Soviet Union would return the Chinese people all that had been taken from them by the Tsarist Empire during the period of so-called unequal treaties. The Soviet government made clear that for this to happen, it would be necessary, first of all, to put an end to the invasion of Manchuria and Siberia by brigands. A few months later, with Soviet forces victorious in the Civil War and less in need of help from China, Karakan's offer was withdrawn, but not forgotten in Beijing. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia has claimed to be its legal successor. By this logic, from China's point of view, Moscow would be responsible for fulfilling unkept Soviet promises to return Russian Far East territories. And since taking power in 1999, President Vladimir Putin has made a series of gestures toward settling these disputes. According to recent Chinese official statements, under his leadership, Russia has on 4 separate occasions returned a total of 173 square kilometers of territory to Chinese sovereignty. Of course, compared to the larger claim of nearly 6 million square kilometers of occupied territory mentioned above, this is only a drop in the ocean.
Dozens of European officials met in the Ukrainian city of Lviv on Friday to endorse the creation of a special tribunal to prosecute Russian officials accused of war crimes in Ukraine. According to Associated Press, standing alongside top Ukrainian government officials in Lviv, European Union Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas said the tribunal's launch will mean that nobody can be left unpunished for the crimes committed. Russian authorities have fiercely denied allegations of war crimes. Once established, the tribunal will focus on prosecuting Russian leaders most responsible for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that began in 2022. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha also announced the EU's intention to allocate almost €1.9 billion for military support to Ukraine. Roughly €1 billion of the total will be used to purchase weapons according to the so-called Danish model, directly from Ukrainian manufacturers.
we take very decisive steps towards justice for Ukraine. After this meeting, we will provide our final political endorsements to establish a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. And this tribunal will ensure that those most responsible for the aggression against Ukraine are held accountable. Every inch of Russia's war has been documented. We are living in an area of information. It has been documented, and there is no space for impunity. Russia's aggression cannot go unpunished, and therefore establishing this tribunal is extremely important.
Отже, можемо розпочинати, пане прем'єр-міністр.
Ми неухильно наближаємося до старту роботи спецтрибуналу для вищих посадових осіб Росії, які віддавали злочинні накази. Країни коаліції провели велику юридичну підготовку. Сьогодні буде прийнято політичне рішення про схвалення роботи цих юридичних команд. Сам процес формування і запуску спеціального трибуналу в межах Ради Європи розпочнеться незабаром. Винні в злочині агресії обов'язково будуть покарані.
Ми вдячні Європейському Союзу за дотримання домовленостей та спрямування другого траншу прибутків від заморожених російських активів на посилення обороноздатності України. По-друге, сьогодні це вже звучало, ми також підписали контракти з 4 державами – Данія, Нідерланди, Франція, Італія – на суму близько мільярда євро. Ці кошти будуть спрямовані на закупівлю озброєння в українських виробників. Очікуємо на швидку імплементацію, щоб українські захисники на передовій отримали вироблену зброю вже в найближчі місяці.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and his wife on Thursday placed a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Kiev as his country marked the day of remembrance and victory over Nazism in the Second World War. According to Associated Press, they were joined at the somber ceremony by Ukrainian officials and representatives of several foreign diplomatic missions. On social media, the president wrote that as Europe marked the defeat of the Nazis, it must be remembered that Ukrainians made their great contribution to that victory. They stopped a global evil with their own blood. And we will not surrender this memory to a new, Russian Nazism, just as we will not surrender our present to it, he added. In his statement, Zelensky also made a dig at Russian President Vladimir Putin, who is hosting world leaders in Moscow for the annual Victory Day military parade in Red Square. Victory and true remembrance are not with those who hold parades, but with those on whose side the truth is, he wrote.